Hello and welcome to the Swinging Christies, the podcast about Agatha Christie in the swinging 60s. I'm Dr. Mark Aldridge, I'm an associate professor, and I read, write and research about Agatha Christie all the time.
All the time, you're obsessed.
Yes.
And I'm Gray Robert Brown, I'm a writer and I'm similarly obsessed. It's like a AA meeting for Christie fans, this. So this week we're rocking, we're rolling, we're twisting, we're shouting. It's rock and roll.
Which do you prefer, mods or rockers?
Don't know. I like any of them. Mockers, I like.
Mark, Dr. Mark Aldridge.
Yeah.
How are you today?
I'm good today, yeah.
Yeah?
We've it's fireworks night tonight.
Is it? I hadn't even
is.
clocked.
Yes. So we're recording at my house where we have two cats, so this will be interesting.
They're somewhere jittering as we speak. No, I feel like James said they're pretty. Your partner said that they're pretty,
quite chilled.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, it's much nicer weather today than it was yesterday.
Yes, we're currently drying your trainers.
Yes, for the listener, we went on had a break in between podcast recording yesterday and went on a lovely walk in questionable or variable weather, shall we say. And I did at one point lose a trainer to a muddy puddle, and I almost Dawn Frenched, actually.
You did, yeah.
You know,
the sinking down.
I almost died, Mark.
You did.
Actually.
The look of terror in your eyes, and then the way the hand came out, as if you were like the little old lady that needs a bit of support, and I had to go back and guide you out.
Yeah, it's the vulnerability that I imagine Miss Marple shows when she falls over in the development.
Yes.
That was what I was channeling. Yes, exactly.
Very
relevant.
Yes. But we're also at a weekend where there's lots of Beatles chat. Which we might come to because there's lots of Beatles in the news.
Oh yes, so they've just released. How many of them are alive?
Two are alive.
Two alive. The Beatles as a concept, because they exist mainly as a concept now, I guess, have released their great long lost and technically final single patched together with vocals and AI, as I understand it.
John Lennon sang a demo in the 70s or late 70s, and then they tried to complete it as a song in the mid-90s when there were three of them, but the quality wasn't good enough. So they've AI'd his vocals so that they now sound good. So still his vocals, but they're much cleaner. And they've taken George Harrison's guitar from the mid-90s.
Okay.
Because he was still alive then. He's not with us anymore.
Right.
And then the other two, Ringo and Paul, have added their bits. So, yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, but we're not Beatles fans, are we?
But it's I did not particularly, I'll admit, although we should probably say that under our breath given the topic of the episode. But the I did see someone on Twitter said that with the Beatles and Doctor Who simultaneously trending, it's basically 1960s again, which is, I mean, that's why
and
we're
us
here.
we'll be trending next. It'll be the three of us together.
I think we're trending already. Yeah. I don't know what you mean. I'd like to know if it's an option to AI my vocals on this podcast, just to do it for me.
Oh,
I'll go
see.
And put my feet up. I mean, yeah, no. So we would be amiss not to begin with the Beatles, I think, who need no introduction as in terms of just how seismic they were for this period, right? And I should say up top that I'm getting a lot of this from an excellent source, which is called Love and Let Die, Bond, Beatles and the British Psyche by John Higgs. And his whole argument is that, well, Dr. No and Love Me Do are released on the same day, and actually these two titans of British culture are intensely kind of saturated in what's interesting about the era, but also become global, and how significant that is, and how he talks a lot about kind of the Beatles representing love and ideas of love and the summer of love that we move on to in 67, and Bond representing death. which is absolutely fascinating. And so this is kind of the backdrop. And I think the other thing to say, they were unashamedly kind of not RP. There was this sort of sense of their personalities, the cheek and the willingness to talk about things like love and romance on a more mainstream scale, which at the time was, I think, maybe lost in the sands of time, but at the time very radical, right? To kind of be so open.
What struck me when I was rereading is that the Beatles seem to have an importance attached to them in the day-to-day conversations in Christie's books in the 1960s that no other pop culture icons really have. Like, she'll talk about Shakespeare and the Bible and classical music, and those references are all the way through her works. But the Beatles are the first sort of contemporary bit of culture that are consistently referred to as a touchstone. And I tell you what really struck me is I started to think, well, where's Elvis? Because Elvis is really the only other icon of this era that you would think would touch the Beatles in terms of the ways that they were received, especially by younger people, and the impact they had on popular culture.
Yeah.
And Elvis never even gets a mention, which says so much, I think, about how the Beatles were a very particular thing. The closest I found to Elvis, and maybe there is a mention of a sort of hip swinging rock and roll singer in a book that I hadn't noticed, but certainly I don't think his name's in it. Yes, do.
If we've
which is very possible. When I was going through the scripts for the Joan Hicks and Miss Marple series, which is the one for the BBC in the 80s and 90s, they do it with mirrors, which is set at a boys' rehabilitation centre, I guess. There actually was a scene that was scripted but cut, in which Miss Marple's wandering around the school and opens a door and finds two teenage boys dancing to Elvis, who then go and sort of look at her, give a little half smile, and then continue dancing. And I'd love to have seen that. I'd love to have seen like how that was played. Because there are quite a few ways that you could play a couple of boys interrupted in their dance. Gyrating to Elvis.
That feels very much like my reading of that is the intention of that scene would be to go look at old world Miss Marple stumbling into the new world and then very literally closing the door on it as well, which is interesting because I don't think you get that sense necessarily in these 60s books. I don't think you get the sense necessarily of characters like Marple closing the door on modernity. I think actually there's a bit more embracing or certainly acceptance that goes on.
Acceptance is the big word, isn't it? Because very often you'll get a perspective of characters who might say that they don't understand it or that it's not something that they enjoy and why couldn't they have something else instead?
Yeah.
But they're not, or very rarely, saying this is a bad thing or this isn't.
Yes.
Just this acceptance of that they don't quite understand it, perhaps.
And a remoteness as a result. But it's interesting. I don't use the word gyrating accidentally because, of course, what Elvis and the Beatles embody and what Christie is engaging with when she references things like the Beatles, in particular, is this sense of licentiousness of the era, the slight kind of daring of transgressing traditional ideas of, sex and what the new youth is symbolizing. And we've got, obviously, that is never more apparent than in Third Girl. Third Girl is a Poirot novel set in swinging London about a young woman who thinks she may have committed a murder from 1966.
There's this interesting thing about how the Beatles are dropped into conversation as sort of part of a wider a change that the 1960s is seeing, and often dropped in with things where you go, are you sure that you want to be do these things actually link together? Like Beatles and Sputniks at one point are spoken about together. You're like, they are not, like, they're really not like yes, they're both quite 60s or late 50s types of things, but the idea that all of this modernity is somehow being lumped together a bit is a bit.
Well, yeah, I think the criticism is that like she's kind of almost magpieing words, like a beatnik is like, or a mod is like a type of fashion and a type of an identity that a subset of youth culture is adopting, right? Whereas I don't think, for example, like Beatles fans didn't call themselves Beatles. The Beatles were just
four of them. But so in Third Girl, a quote: "Oh, Norma, silly girl, goes about in dreadful clothes and is picked up with a dreadful young man. Ah, well, they're all alike
nowadays. Long-haired young fellows, beatniks, Beatles, all sorts of names they've got. I can't keep up with them, practically talk a foreign language.
Yeah.
So saying Beatles there, like you say, as if that is a subset
Like
of
a
culture.
tribe.
Yeah, a
Yeah.
tribe.
And we get similar in The Pale Horse. The Pale Horse is a standalone novel that explores mysterious goings-on and unexplained deaths at a countryside inn from 1961. We get Ariadne Oliver saying, everything happens there. She's talking about Chelsea, beatniks and Sputniks and squares and the beat generation. But I think, there's a reading that Christie's just kind of misunderstanding. I think, given what we're going to go on to talk about as well, I think that's reductive. I don't think that's true. I think there is a point to make here about there was this tribalism in I think, as communication expanded, I think as technology developed, I think you do see a sense of tribalism in youth culture. And I think it would be reductive to say that Christie is not understanding the differences by doing these little lists of types of people that she does, because there's that famous interview, I think I sourced it when we were doing our research, where the Beatles are being interviewed and they're asked, which do you prefer, mods or rockers? And they sort of joke about it, and then they go mockers. And so there is, that doesn't feel dissimilar from Christie linking, beatniks and Beatles and Sputniks to me. I think that's actually engaging in the terminology of the time. And she hangs a lantern on that by saying practically a foreign language they speak.
Yeah. I think that, the mods and rockers is the thing that makes a bit more sense. If you think retrospectively, we differentiate, but of course, when you're in the middle of it, that's not necessarily the way that you do. So she might well be thinking in terms of that she understands this tribalism exists. And I also think that there is this thing about the Beatles' haircuts and stuff like that, their fashion being hugely influential. So why wouldn't you think that people are trying to be Beatles?
Well, it sort of reminded me of, how does Mariah Carey call her fans lambs?
Yeah.
Like that kind of thing, or like little monsters, or, it's almost like predating that. Basically what I'm saying is Christie anticipated Mariah Carey, Lady Gaga, all of them.
Yeah, in fact, All I Want for Christmas Is You, the lyrics are actually in Star Over Bethlehem. I'm pretty sure that Agatha Christie wrote that.
I can't tell if you're joking or not.
No, I'm joking.
Tune in for our Christmas special.
The extensive legal case will now be started.
If the Beatles are symbolising all the kind of themes that are coming together to make this new generation, and we know that that's something that Christie's engaging with, in particular in Third Girl, right? I'm going to rain on our parade again and just give the kind of Sandbrook caveat, which I've been doing. There is this perception looking back at the 60s that everyone was a beatnik or a Beatle and actually there were millions and millions of people who were just sitting at home listening to the Wireless. And Sandbrook makes the fascinating point that the film soundtrack of The Sound of Music was infinitely more successful sales-wise than even the most successful Beatles album, which was Abbey Road, sold 9 million. Meanwhile, The Sound of Music soundtrack held the number one spot for almost 70 weeks. Yeah. There is this, and obviously in this dichotomy, I guess Sound of Music is representing the old world and Beatles very much the new world. And he even says, he makes the point that, he says, on an average Saturday morning in December 1963, up to 1 million people might rush out to buy the latest number one record, but at the same time, a staggering 19 million looked forward to another day pottering about the garden and nursing the flower beds through the winter. So, I think as well, we should always remember that characters like Miss Marple that are, well, she's sadly in Mirror Crack not able to potter about the garden, is she? We'll talk about that in another episode. But they're not actually in the minority, the sorts of people that Christie's often writing about, although it is true that she writes about other types of people as well. Yeah. So you said that, obviously we know that Christie mentions the Beatles. You made the point when we were talking about this before that she rarely mentions specifically the music.
Yeah, exactly. So she talks about them more as
a symbol.
Yes, a symbol. That's it, right. Part of popular culture, cultural movements, and sort of leading a lot of the way that young people might think about themselves and expressing themselves in this much more relaxed, informal, dare we say Liverpudlian way, the way that you can actually, that you're not sort of bound up in perhaps, London values or old-fashioned values that might have gone before. So yeah, she talks about that, but really not much about their music. But but I do have a nice little exclusive for us, because
We should have a fanfare there.
we should have. So, as you know, I spend quite a lot of time each year at the Agatha Christie Family Archive, the Christie Archive Trust. So last time I went there, I was picked up from the station by Mathew Prichard, Agatha's grandson, and we were driving on the way there. And I was chatting about this project to him, and we were talking about various things, and we got talking about the Beatles. And he told me a great story about the first time that Agatha Christie really listened to the Beatles. And he got to the end of this brilliant story, and I said, that is a great story. Thank you, Matthew. When we get home, I would like to record you telling me that story. So we had a little interview about various things, and we may come back to it in other episodes. But this in particular, I think, is a really nice insight into Agatha Christie's reaction to the later Beatles music.
I forget where we were. We were probably at home at Portherac, and I had the Beatles on, full blast in my study, and my grandmother sort of poked her head around the door and said, "Is that the Beatles?" So I said yes. She said, "Do you mind if I come in and listen to it?" Because I haven't actually, because it's well publicised she didn't have a television. She didn't actually. If she had a radio, it was never turned on to the popular channels. So she came in. And I remember we had a very famous song by the Beatles called "Let It Be" on at the time, and she listened to it. "Let It Be" actually was quite long because it has a lot of repetition in it. And so we got to the end. So I said, "What do you think?" "Well," she said, "I don't know what all the fuss is about. I think it's wonderful." And she loved "Yesterday" and all Paul McCartney's solo songs, and she had a great ability, my grandmother, to recognise genuine talent when she heard it or saw it.
That's fantastic.
So the big revelation here is that she's a McCartney stan. Like, Paul McCartney was the Beatles that she associated. But I think it's interesting that she is clearly not seeing that there should be any fuss about this new type of music that perhaps is a bit more experimental, that she's just enjoying it for what it is. She was really open-minded. She loved new... I've said before, but she went to theatre a lot. I'm going to touch on that later. But all of this popular culture, she might not necessarily love all of it, but she's interested by it. And clearly for Let It Be and some of the later Beatles stuff, according to Matthew, she got pleasure out of it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We're so lucky to have insights like that. Okay, so we know what Christie thought of the Beatles. What did Poirot think? What did Miss Marple think?
Around this time, her Italian publisher sent her a questionnaire, which included the question of what did she think Miss Marple and Poirot would think of the Beatles, which shows how big the Beatles were, that this should even be a question. She seemed to put real thought into the responses here, because for Miss Marple, she said, "Miss Marple, I remember, never really liked the steel bands in the West Indies," which indeed she doesn't in A Caribbean Mystery from 1964.
Yep.
She would, I feel, be upset and would deplore the wrecking of their vocal cords by overproduction, and would probably beg them to study voice production before it was too late.
Wow, okay. That's quite a different perspective from the one we got from from Matthew's.
Yes,
from Matthew's
absolutely.
comment.
Yeah, and I guess that also there are this thing about their vocals being not necessarily aggressive, but they're not sort of gentle.
Yes, that suggests that the makers of BBC, Joan Hickson, were right in suggesting she might slam the door on Elvis.
But she also gave a response about Poirot.
So in the same interview, asked the equivalent
they asked him about
what Poirot would think. She said he would congratulate them warmly on their success and popularity, shudder inwardly at the general untidiness of their appearance, possibly ask if any of them had considered growing a very fine moustache.
So probably pre-Sergeant Pepper here, because dashes do arrive.
I'm also reminded of a quote. There's a bit in Halloween Party.
Halloween Party is a Poirot mystery novel in which a girl is drowned while apple bobbing from 1969.
Where Ariadne Oliver, as is well known, is sort of to some extent a cipher of Christie herself. And there's some discussion about how Mrs. Oliver is asked her opinion on all sorts of things that are just in the news and is expected to have a take on them that is kind of public ready. And again, that's a very modern kind of, that feels very now actually, but also one suspects that Christie is maybe airing her feelings on being asked questions like this in that.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, it makes sense to ask her about music because music was such a big part of her life. She was always fascinated by it. We know that she wanted to be a pianist when she was young. And she, even like composed a waltz and stuff.
Yes, which we heard recently when we went to Greenway. It was being played, wasn't it?
It was, yes.
Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, it is. So we went there for... as part of the International Agatha Christie Festival, one of the fringe events. On her birthday, they always have a special dinner. And one of the volunteers very kindly and enthusiastically played Agatha Christie's waltz, which a couple of guests danced to.
Yes, I think she was disappointed that more guests did not dance to it, but you and I were not dancing.
No, we didn't dance. No.
And she goes to classical concerts even, right?
Yeah, she does. And again, to bring Matthew back into it, Matthew tells a story about them going to Austria and Matthew going with a group of his friends. And I think they sort of did camping or something like that. It wasn't very, posh, luxury, however they were staying. But his grandmother and Max were there as well. And they had a sort of deal that I think Agatha and Max basically fed them once a day, I think, or it ensured that there was like food around, or took them out for a dinner or whatever, that they were there sort of as a bit of a safety net, perhaps. But it meant that, of course, Matthew was a young man, so he's in his 20s at this point, because it was in the 60s, and lots of other, young friends of his as well, which I think you see feeding into things like Endless Night.
Endless Night is a standalone psychological thriller in which young couple Michael and Ellie are menaced by unusual happenings. It's from 1967.
That has a young male narrator, so our protagonist, and Matthew has always felt that he was partially based, not necessarily on Matthew himself, but on things that Agatha Christie has observed Matthew and his friends. So it all comes together. It's all due to music. They'd all gone to Austria to listen to music. And we see Wagner in particular being important in Passenger to Frankfurt.
Passenger to Frankfurt is a standalone espionage thriller about Sir Stafford Nye's hunt for answers from 1970.
Where actually going to a concert is, in typical spy type fashion, a great way to swap secrets and various things to happen. And we hear from Sir Stafford Nye, who's our protagonist, talking about having gone to the youth festival this year and heard Wagner, and Wagner being very important.
So when we first started talking about covering music as part of this project, I'm fairly sure the first thing you said was, there's Deathbeat. And I was like, what on earth is Deathbeat? Please, Dr. Mark Aldridge, do enlighten us. It's a great title.
But it is a great title. So Deathbeat is a project that I think it's a really good premise, and it got really far, and she was really into it in the early 60s. It was basically an attempt to make a stage musical out of Hickory Dickory Dock, which is a Poirot novel from the mid-50s that's all about a student hostel. So there's lots of young characters who are from different backgrounds interacting with each other. So you can see why in the 60s that, even though it's not a favourite novel of mine, that would actually be a pretty good candidate for more modern theatre. So the music was by Alexis Weisenberg, and it was written by John Wells. And it got really far. There's a full script. Songs were written for it and recorded, and very jazzy, as you say. So very, very 1960s. And Christie cooperated well with it. They met up, they played songs to her. She was really, really positive about it. And there was a full script by the end of 1963. For whatever reason, it didn't go forward, which is a real shame, because I think it would have been fascinating. And I think the problem now is, even though we have the components, I guess, for it to be staged, it's such a 60s thing that it almost needs to be situated.
But it's great to hear that. It's great to hear that she was willing to hear them out, actually, as a prospect, because I think we hear so much about this slightly cantankerous character being negative about adaptations, but I think that goes to show that if the idea is intriguing and maybe they tapped into her general love of music within that, then she'll certainly hear what they have to say, which is fascinating, I think. Yeah, so I think it's important to keep reiterating that this type of music is not existing in a vacuum, and actually it gets very closely connected in the press and is connected in terms of just generally what's going on in youth culture. And we mentioned Third Girl already, but also in books like The Pale Horse, we see, talk about going to coffee bars and nightclubs, and the increased leisure time and the increased boundary pushing, arguably, of kind of the generation that's growing up at this point. And you picked out a lovely little bit in The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding.
The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding and a Selection of Entrees is a collection of early short stories, including the titular The Adventure of the Christmas Pudding, or The Theft of the Royal Ruby, and The Mystery of the Spanish Chest, both of which were rewritten for publication in 1960.
Yeah, which was a bit of a surprise because, so you think it's going to be quite old-fashioned. It opens with an introduction, the collection, about her reminiscing about her early Christmases. And yeah, she's obviously really thought about bringing it up to date, because there's a brilliant bit that I thought, this is so true. This reminds me of my Christmases when I was young, of where at the sort of slightly dull, slightly quiet part of Christmas Day, one of the characters says, of the teenagers and younger people, I expect they'll go and play with their tape recorders now. You think, God, that's such, that's something you obviously couldn't have done in the 1920s when she's first writing this story. But also, it's so true, isn't it? Didn't you used to do that Christmas that you would sort of get your toys or your, whatever you were given as a present?
I still do that to this day.
You would disappear into your own room and get on with it.
Play with his DVDs.
To play with your DVDs. But that also slightly links into this idea that you were just saying about the clubs and the coffee bars and stuff, that they are young people only spaces. So a space where young people congregate, and you wouldn't get Miss Marple or Poirot wandering in. And it's sort of similar with this. Like, tape recorders are such an alien concept. They can go and play with it.
They go off and play with them separately.
It's never going to be, that they're not playing Monopoly together or something. It's something that is very much focused on them.
But like you say, it's interesting that Christie thought to pop in that detail in a story that could have otherwise been left, but given how much of the story is about harking back to Christmases past, it could have been left in this kind of quote unquote never never land that we always hear Christie writes in. But actually, so much of this project is about kind of debunking that notion. We have as well in Third Girl, we have this sense of Mrs. Oliver again makes the point that young people are so trained on their own kind of culture that that's all they know in terms of education. She says that the only names they know are pop singers or groups or disc jockeys, that sort of thing.
And don't forget, we're talking pre-Radio 1 here. So we're in an era, yeah. So Radio 1 doesn't come in until 1967. There are other pirate stations, really, that we're doing. That is a mainstream thing. The BBC, for those of you who perhaps aren't in Britain, Radio 1 is the radio station that's focused on modern music, pop music, chart music, what young people are listening to very much. But yeah, so it wasn't even that it was massively mainstream in terms of our understanding of disc jockeys, but she clearly is keeping an ear out, keeping an eye out, and understanding that.
Yeah, even knowing that terminology, I think, is interesting. And yeah, and we should say as well, there's this, I mentioned it before, but there's a purported link, perhaps in more sort of small C conservative circles, of the aggressive and the bold aspects of that music, and then with increasing transgressive values and violence. Sam Brook talks a lot about the kind of particularly male youth subcultures that are doing things like the incident in Easter weekend 1964. Christie talks about young people smashing up phone boxes, I think, in Pricking of My Thumbs. Because I'm thinking like the emergence of the Rolling Stones, the huge popularity of the Rolling Stones, the emergence of Led Zeppelin, and that being connected to violent behaviour or violent incidents that you see in... It's a link that's being made in the press by the older generation, and it's a link that Christie is aware of as well.
So obviously you can read Agatha Christie writing about music as much as you like, but you can't hear it. So when you have things like the film adaptations in this decade, they've got to make a choice, right, about what sort of music do you have to accompany, say, a Miss Marple film, which has got a really distinctive theme tune.
It's unmissable, isn't it? I think because it plays a lot. I was struck when we watched Murder at the Gallops fairly recently.
Murder at the Gallop is a loose film adaptation of After the Funeral with Margaret Rutherford's Miss Marple from 1963.
Just how often that theme tune comes on, and I'm not complaining because I love it, and it is so swinging, isn't it? Like it's got that kind of rat-a-tat drum. And actually, that kind of swinging rock and roll does play a more important part in towards the end of Murder at the Gallows.
Oh yeah, of course.
There's that brilliant sequence where we're actually given a lot of exposition through a dance scene. And so we're treated to Marple and Mr. Enderby dancing to some more sort of traditional music, shall we say. And then I think it's the band switches to something more hip, and he says to her,
I think perhaps we better sit this one out. Dreadful not dancing at all.
Rutherford's Marple does actually say, one has to be tolerant of the young, Mr. Enderby. I remember my dear mama was quite horrified when she caught me doing the Charleston. And it's, you know, it's a funny little aside, but also I do think that's kind of the point that Christie's making a few times, like we saw last episode where she's staking the claim to the fact that older people had sex too. You know, there were transgressive music genres and dances in her day, just as there are today. And then we have, I think I'm right in saying we have Mr. Stringer comes on.
Ah, there's Mr. Stringer. As it happens, this is his favourite dance.
And they do actually twist.
They do
the twist.
They do it, and it's there because it's funny, but also it's used as a way for her to be able to communicate information to him. Like, because other people are not going to interrupt them doing this twist. This, I don't say intimate, but you're sort of facing each other doing this dance in a way that they can
it is
communicate.
A bit intimate, is it? Or it is intimate, yeah. And then you're right, it's used to impart kind of crucial plot information.
Do your best, Mr. Stringer. This is the only way I could get you alone.
But also she then uses it as the moment that she will then overexert herself and collapse, which is going to be the kind of crucial plot climax. That's how she's going to then catch the killer.
By pretending to collapse. So it's like,
yes, yeah.
She's onlookers might think, oh, she's trying to be too young and trying to overexert herself. Of course, Miss Marple knows exactly what she's doing.
Exactly, and she's way fitter and way more down with the kids than people are giving her credit for. Exactly, that's the point. So moving on to the 65, And Then There Were None.
And Then There Were None is a film adaptation of the titular story about a group of guests picked off one by one by a mysterious killer. This one's from 1965.
A pop star plays a very important part in that.
Yeah, so we have Fabian, who was a pop star of the time.
Stunt casting.
It's complete stunt casting. It's exactly what a producer now would do.
Yeah.
Can you imagine saying, right, so we're doing this new modern swinging version of And Then There Were None. We don't want it to feel old-fashioned. We want young people to come and see this film. We have someone who is going to sing and play the piano right at the beginning of the film. They're not going to have many lines, and they're the first one to die.
Yeah.
You absolutely would cast a pop star. You would go
completely.
and cast Sam Smith or something in that role, wouldn't you?
It's Dua Lipa in Barbie. I mean, not that she gets killed off, but as in it is the same principle, isn't it? And it's interesting. So he's playing Mike Raven, is that right?
That's right.
And the character in the script of the film is also a pop star or an entertainer, I think he describes himself. But he's the equivalent of Anthony Marston in the book, who is not a pop star. I can't remember what.
He's just sort of a slightly obnoxious younger man who, which I guess plays
the analog
into
to the 60s
Yes.
it's interesting. And it's I think again, like with the using the twist in the climax of Murder at the Gallop, the fact that he's a pop star is not incidental to the plot, because actually they use his skill and what audiences will know him for to impart the full rhyme that is the crucial sort of spine of the piece, because it tells us how each character is going to be picked off one by one.
So he went out and hanged himself. And then
But yeah, we see him play the rhyme on the piano, and at the end of it, General Mandrake really takes the wind out of his sails by saying,
And now, sir, will you be good enough to cease that infernal noise?
yeah, so he slightly obnoxious is the word, he says,
You've probably all heard of Mike Raven and the Blackbirds? No? Where's everybody been lately?
You a singer?
Yeah, number 3 on the charts last week.
I mean, only number 3.
Yes,
though.
that's what I thought.
I'm
well
sure
done. I couldn't get a number 3.
That's
Don't get me
true.
wrong.
I'm
but-
sure that somebody said to me once that it was much harder to get a number 1 back in the day.
Yes.
But and he even tells us what the single's called. Do you remember what the single's called?
I do not remember what the single's
It's
called.
It's got a slightly overlong title. Why does my baby do this to me when we could be in love?
Catchy.
Or maybe that's the full first line of the chorus, and really it's called Baby Brackets Love or something. That feels swinging to me. But yeah, you talk about this and Gallop and, well, all of the adaptations, of course, in your excellent book, if you don't mind me saying, Agatha Christie on Screen. And there's also this sense, because we've got the kind of Goldfinger pin-up, as we talked about in the last episode of Shirley Eaton, we've got Dahlia Lavi's character, who's in the fiction of it an actress, and there's this sense that they are the swinging youngsters, and they're glamorous and they're starry, and they're held in contrast with the other characters, aren't they? I also wanted to pick out, there's a really groovy kind of hero soundtrack accompanying Groman's attempted escape, you know, when he's trying to get away and he's like what's it called, where you're
pickaxe?
like pickaxing down the mountain, but the music in it is really swinging. And then he goes the way his wife did. They both succumb to the element
in a really quite vicious way. I mean, it's a
awful.
famously vicious book in lots of ways anyway. So it's not like this is a 60s invention.
No.
But some of it's really horrifying. Like the cable car snapping,
which is how his wife dies. Yeah.
That serves a good plot function, but
it's also very Bondian, I think. I think both the stunts of both. It's interesting that they get these big exterior stunt sequence deaths, whereas everyone else, I think I'm right in saying, pretty much is killed either in the house or in the grounds, and it's a bit more domestic. The aesthetics of the film are fascinating.
It does surprise me that they didn't make it in colour, because we're in 1965, we're trying to appeal to a younger audience. The James Bond films are in colour. Even cheaper films are in colour now by the mid-60s. By a year or two's time after 1965, you're really got almost no films that are made in black and white. So it's right at the end of the slightly cheaper British films often being in black and white. So I think that's a real shame. But in terms of its cinematography, it really works. The starkness of the white, because they're up a mountain, with everything else. But that would have made it really swinging. I'd love to have seen some of those costumes.
Yeah.
I'd love to have seen what Shirley Eaton and Dahlia Lavi would have. And Fabian, and maybe a lovely sort of flower power shirt or something.
Yes,
a little bit early for that, but that idea would have been great. Something a bit more psychedelic.
Talking about bursting into vivid colour, we watched the beautiful Blu-ray restored Endless Night adaptation, which, although is 1972, we both agreed is fascinating in terms of this topic, in terms of it's pretty swinging, and in particular that music.
Yes, yeah. Again, this sort of experimental music that I very nearly did my own little vocal impression.
No, please do.
No, but lots of why. Yes, exactly.
Like that was me. That wasn't Mark's cat. That was me doing that.
Tell nobody, not even your closest friend, the terrifying secret of Endless Night.
But that as a soundtrack to an Agatha Christie film,
it's radical.
It really is radical.
Yeah, it's very experimental. It feels quite radiophonic workshop, that kind of like, and or the other thing I thought of was the Twilight Zone, that sort of the sort of twang of it, and you get it at the beginning, and then you get it as the film spins off its axis and it turns into more psychological thriller horror towards the end. But we were also talking when we watched it. I loved it, by the way. Thank you for introducing me to it. And of course, it is based on a 60s novel. But we were talking a lot about how 60s the aesthetics feel in terms of so many of the shots look like they could have been taken from Blow Up. You know, the sequences of our two lead characters, the Michael and the Ellie character, in a field, and he's a voyeur and she's beautiful and he's watching her, and he's even, I think, got a camera, which is exactly the same setup we get in Blow Up, which is 1966. And even the casting of Hal Bennett as Michael, who looks quite a lot like David Hemmings, who plays Thomas, the lead in Blow Up. It's really striking, those comparisons. I'd be surprised if there wasn't some inspiration being taken there.
So do you get the sense when Agatha Christie's talking about these pop singers that she's sort of just mystified by it, or she's worried about it? Because I think that there's a little bit of a hint of both, isn't there?
Yeah.
Because in Passenger to Frankfurt, there's a whole thing about pop singers being seen as messiahs.
Yeah, in celebrity and pop stars being held up in such kind of high regard, and the hysteria around. We haven't really talked about, Beatlemania and things like reports of young girls just piercingly screaming and even kind of wetting the seats of gig venues, and that kind of obsession that really starts with the Beatles. I wouldn't be surprised if Christie was slightly dumbfounded by that. I think a lot of people were, and not just kind of small C conservative people.
Yeah, because there's this thing about, and she's not saying that pop singer is actually going to be a messiah, but she's equating the way that people talk about pop singers. So she does this thing of talking about the young Siegfried's going to perhaps lead this revolution, this youth-focused revolution. And she says, I don't know if he's a person or a password or the name of a club or a new messiah or a pop singer. So that's quite interesting that she's obviously thinking in these terms of people who seem to be able to exert control over other people, especially young people.
They're depicted as being headed by this person who is incredibly charismatic, who has a beautiful singing voice. And what does that sound like? It is like she's warning us of the danger of putting anyone on a pedestal, perhaps.
Yeah, and I wonder if she's also mindful of the obviously very famous misquote of John Lennon, not saying that the Beatles are bigger than Jesus, but actually saying more popular than Jesus, which is one of those quotes that created almost no ripples at the time, and then in America picked it up rather later, and then it caused a few ripples across the pond. But this idea of equating pop bands, pop singers with that sort of religious idol. Yeah, iconography.
Idolization. Yeah, completely. Yeah, and actually the way that the young Siegfried kind of plays the stadium, there are these incredible epic sequences in Passenger to Frankfurt. He does hold a vast group of people very basically in the palm of his hand. We hear that people are kind of roused and they're surging. It sounds like Beatlemania. She even says in Passenger to Frankfurt, some of the girls have been screaming with enthusiasm. Some of them had fainted. That is literally the response to the Beatles. She also, interestingly, describes them as a yellow-haired band of the young supermen. I think she's saying Aryan, yeah. But I also think yellow is interesting because Yellow Submarine. I don't know. There's definitely more to say there. He kind of leads the stadium in a song, and they sang with unusual beauty of tone and voice. She writes, after a good many years of pop music, Stafford Nye, who's the main character in Passenger to Frankfurt, felt an incredulous pressure. Trained voices these, not raucous shouting, trained by masters of the singing art, not allowed to strain their vocal cords to be off key. So there's a begrudging respect of how beautiful the singing is. But it's also clearly holding a power, and they're clearly the villains as well. So there's it's working on multiple levels, I think, this. We're told specifically that the music had Wagnerian themes and echoes of the Rhine music. So she is explicitly coding these throughout the novel, and we'll talk about this more in a later episode, but she is explicitly coding them as fascists. And I don't think she's saying that pop stars are neo-Nazis. I think she's using two very potent, very contemporary touchstones and cultural reference points to make her point there.
Well, we also see in a less sinister way pop stars being important to young people in Halloween Party, don't we?
Yes. Yeah. So they play that game.
Which sounds fascinating. I wish I could quite work out.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how it works. So two of the boys dress up as various potential husbands with kind of makeup and adding sideburns and things like that.
The idea is that there's a game where the girls at the party can see their future husband in the
Listener,
mirror.
you can tell that we've never been to a proper slumber party, I think. But yeah, and one of the girls says that her future husband, the future husband that she sees, looks like Eddie Presswaite, the pop singer. Don't you think so? He's fictional, right? That's someone that
it's not a great pop star name. That's the sort of thing that
Eddie
you'd hear.
Presswaite.
Yeah, they're there. Can you believe that, Cliff used to be called Eddie Presswaite or something.
Do you think it sounds like the name before this?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You
yeah.
would change that and you become, the king or something.
But we are told that Mrs. Oliver did think that he looked like one of the faces she daily deplored having to see in her morning paper. It's not beyond the realms of possibility to imagine Christie seeing faces like those in the paper and that lodging in her brain somewhere for this sequence. But I think there's a really, the image of this kind of roll call of fake potential husbands for these young girls that are being kind of duped into essentially just seeing boys, like local boys, like dressed bizarrely. It's a really interesting image. I think there's something to say there about gender and courting in the late 60s.
And also that these pop singers are just like any other young man. that you
That's
put a
true.
beard on them and sideburns and make them seem a bit exciting, and suddenly they're these people that people are screaming for.
Yeah. But I think hand in hand with associating these pop stars with the sort of, man that you maybe wouldn't want your daughter going out with, I think actually, Sandbrook talks about how a lot of the appeal of certainly the Beatles in particular was because they were kind of perfect, especially at the start of the decade. They were kind of perfect and non-threatening, and he even says what real life boys at school could compete with them. So it's ironic that then we're getting the real life boys at school in Halloween Party dressing up and pretending to be people that look like pop stars that Ariadne sees in the paper. It's kind of circles within circles, isn't it? But as we come towards the end of the decade, I think it very much, the Beatles go on such a journey, and near the beginning of the decade, they're just starting out. By the end of the decade, they're kind of breaking apart and dying, and the music develops a lot in that time. But we also have this sense that they're kind of at the forefront, along with lots of other acts, of the Summer of Love in 1967, this kind of popularization of the importance of peace and love and harmony, and it intersects with campaigns around nuclear disarmament. And we're going to talk in later episodes about how the Beatles inspired people to find a sense of kind of spiritualism and maybe substances and all sorts of things. But we have in 69 we have, and I'm getting this from Steve Nicholson, we have two legendary open-air pop festivals. We have Woodstock, but we also have the first Festival in the Isle of Wight.
So my dad actually, I think, went to that festival. At least went to one of the really early ones. Yeah.
So how old would he have been?
He would have been 18, I think, at that point.
Wow, okay.
So... But
perfect.
And of course, in typical dad fashion, the story that I only have got was how terrible the traffic was to get there.
Just such a that's exactly the sort of thing that Christie would have said. So, there's an affinity there. That's lovely. Okay, next time we're looking at Money and Agatha Christie in the 60s. It's very exciting. But in the meantime, please get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. How can they contact us, Dr. Mark Aldridge?
You can find us on X and Instagram at Christie_time. And you can also find our individual accounts on X. I'm at Dr. Mark Aldridge and Gray is at classic_Graham.
Yes, and you can also email us at theswingingchristies@gmail.com. And of course, you'll find on our socials links to Mark's books. There's On Screen, there's The Greatest Detective in the World, Poirot, and there's the forthcoming Miss Marple book, which we are so excited for. I highly recommend it. I've had a sneak peek at it already and it is fantastic. You're looking at me modestly as I say that. Until next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks for bopping and tapping your foot along with us. The Swinging Christies is a Christie Time project by Dr. Mark Aldridge and Gray Robert Brown. This episode was recorded on the 5th of November 2023. Our artwork was designed by Bartlett Studio and our music is by Dar Golan. Little treat. You have, you don't like Sayers, do you?
I have got quite a lot of hers.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
Oh, I might borrow that actually. That's the one.
Which
about
one's that?
Isn't it?
Oh yeah, I've read that one. Yeah.
Is it all right?
Yeah, it is.
I mean, I don't
one
like
of the
it,
better
but-
ones because some of her stuff goes on and on and on and
The one we did at uni was terrible.
which was. Did you do the one about the train stations?
No, Strange
That's
Poison.
Oh
Which
yeah,
has,
I quite
a
like that
seance and
one.
Stuff. Ugh.
I mean, relative, but you read them and go, God, she's not as good as
Christie, is she?
And Christie survived for a reason.
Yeah, exactly. That's why no one's reading.
Is this our tag?
Yeah,
slagging off Dorothy L. Sayers.
At the end of every episode, we will tell you another mystery writer whose work we do not like. We'll work our way through all of them until Christie is the only one surviving.
Like the Hunger Games.
Yes, exactly. Sayers, I'm sorry, you're out in the first round.
Yeah, next week, tune in to hear us
take
down
Naya
Marsh.
Marsh.